The autumn rain had turned the old training ground at Grafenwöhr into a grey mirror of mud and standing water when Oberfeldingenieur Karl Heinemann first saw the odometer reading. The Willys stood under a low tin roof beside a row of abandoned Kübelwagens, its olive drab paint dulled by years of dust and sun, American white stars half sanded away. A mechanic had wiped a clean circle in the grime on the speedometer cluster, just large enough for the numbers to stare back at them. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. 50,000 miles, roughly 80,000 kilometers. Heinemann did the conversion twice in his head, then once more on the back of a cigarette packet with a pencil stub, as if arithmetic might be kinder to his pride than his eyes. Das kann nicht stimmen, he said finally. That cannot be right. The young conscript standing beside him shifted uneasily, boots squelching in the mud. Our meter matches, Herr Oberingenieur. Service book too. The Americans documented every oil change. It all lines up. Behind them, the October wind rattled the rusted corrugated roof. Somewhere on the range, a distant diesel coughed into life. Heinemann stepped closer to the Jeep, gloved fingers tracing the raised Willys stamped into the hood sheet metal. It was a simple, almost crude thing compared to the machines he had spent his career designing and maintaining. He had overseen test benches for Maybach engines, written inspection procedures for half-tracks, sworn on the precision of German metallurgy. In the winter of 1944, he had watched Panthers die on the march after barely 600 kilometers. Now, 10 years later, he was being asked to believe that an American light truck had run more than 80,000 kilometers across Europe and still came in under its own power. He pulled himself up into the driver's seat. The canvas cushion sagged, but the springs beneath held. The smell was a mixture of old oil, canvas, and something dry and metallic, like a toolbox that had been shut for years. The pedals were worn to bare metal under the balls of countless boots. The steering wheel rim was polished, almost smooth. Heinemann settled his hand on the bakelite knob of the gear lever and closed his eyes. He imagined the path those numbers on the odometer represented. Mud tracks in Normandy, hedgerow lanes around Saint-Lô, frozen roads in the Ardennes, broken cobblestones between the Ruhr towns, the long, straight ribbon of the Reichsautobahn, from the Rhine to the Elbe. None of his own army's light vehicles had lived long enough to trace such a map. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He opened his eyes, exhaled slowly, and reached forward. The ignition switch was a simple toggle. No key, no ritual. Heinemann glanced at the mechanic. Fuel? Fresh can from the depot, Herr Oberingenieur. Oil topped up, battery charged yesterday. Heinemann flipped the switch, pressed the starter. The flathead 4 turned twice, coughed, and caught with a steady, almost indifferent rumble. There was no drama in it, no sense of a delicate machine being coaxed back to life. It simply started. The exhaust sent a lazy plume of white breath into the cold air. The oil pressure needle climbed into the green and stayed there. He let it idle, listening with a professional's ear. No obvious knock, no rhythmic misfire, no uneven hunting up and down. Just the low, regular beat of a working engine that had done its job for longer than any German design of the war had been allowed to. Heinemann glanced back at the other men. Some of them had fought in 1944. They knew what this sound would have meant then. "Bring me the maintenance book," he said. The mechanic handed up a thick, oil-stained booklet with English text and neat columns of typed entries. The cover read, "Truck 1 4-ton, 4-4, Willys Overland Model MB, lubrication and service record." On the first pages, a U.S. Army unit designation from early 1943, an APO number from Britain. Then, in regular intervals, oil change at 1,800 miles, valve adjustment at 5,000, differential service at 10,000, gearbox inspection at 15. Pinned in the middle was a later sheet stamped in French, then another in Dutch. After the war, American depots had handed the vehicle over to Allied armies, and the record had simply continued. A column in French handwriting summarized the total mileage when the Jeep was finally withdrawn from active service and transferred to West German custody. 50,112 miles. Heinemann turned a page. At the back, a brief note in English, written in a different hand from the wartime entries. Vehicle reached 50,000 warps with original engine block, crank and head, no major overhaul. Rings and bearings, changed in field, as needed, still serviceable. He closed the book and sat with it on his knee for several quiet seconds. In 1943, he had read armored force bulletins that called 800 to 1,000 kilometers a respectable engine life for a Panzer III or IV under combat conditions. In 1944, the technical reports for the Maybach HL 230 in Panthers and Tigers had admitted that many units needed major work after 600 or even 400 kilometers in the east. In the Ardennes, he had seen row after row of heavy tanks left by the roadside with seized engines and broken transmissions, victims of cold, bad oil, and overwork. Now, an American quarter-ton truck that weighed barely more than a Kübelwagen sat idling in front of him after a life 10 times as long. "Where did this one come from?" he asked. "Records say it was shipped to Britain in early 1943, the mechanic answered. "Landings in Normandy, then assigned to a divisional headquarters. After the war, passed to the French, then the Dutch military police, came back in a surplus lot last year." Heinemann climbed down from the seat and walked around to the front of the vehicle. The hood latch was a simple catch. He flipped it, swung the panel up, and braced it on its stay. There it was, the Willys Go Devil engine, an inline 4-cylinder of 2.2 litres, with its cast-iron head, downdraft carburetor, and simple plumbing. No overhead camshafts, no complicated gear trains, no exotic alloys visible to the naked eye. Just a compact block with manifolds hugging its flanks, a generator, a fan, a water pump, and a belt connecting them. Heinemann ran his fingers along the casting marks, reading part numbers and dates. He could see where some components had been replaced, a newer fuel pump, a generator with a later rebuild tag, hoses that had clearly not seen the beaches of Normandy. But the core of the engine was original. He had read the captured American technical manuals by then. He knew the ratings by heart: 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute, torque around 149 Newton meters at 2,000, enough to haul a 1/4-ton truck and 4 soldiers up a 30-degree slope through mud and snow at speeds his own light vehicles struggled to reach in the best of conditions. He also knew the Army's official expectations for the Jeep's service life, in training documents translated by the Allies after the war. There were tables that spoke of expected engine life in the thousands of miles before major overhaul. In American test grounds, like Aberdeen, Jeeps had logged 800 hard kilometers off-road without a single significant failure, then carried on. But seeing the abstractions of tables made real in front of him, an engine that had not only reached but exceeded numbers German designs had never approached, was something else entirely. He pulled the dipstick, wiped it on a rag, checked the oil again. Clean, honey-coloured, near the full mark. "Open the air cleaner," he said. They unlatched the oil bath filter, lifted the cap. The oil inside was dark with dust, but still fluid. The gauze element above it looked worn, but intact. Heinemann nodded to himself. He had spent most of the war watching engines die from what this simple assembly had prevented. Fine dust in North Africa, grinding cylinder bores into ovals, ice and frozen coolant cracking Maybach blocks in East Prussian forests, overheated oil turning to tar in neglected sumps. American engineers had not tried to make their engines invulnerable. They had simply assumed the worst and made maintenance as easy as possible. Change the oil often, keep the filters clean, make sure every depot anywhere from Norfolk to Naples could stock the same parts. Train a farm boy from Kansas to follow a lubrication chart printed in simple language. The result was idling in front of him, steady and indifferent to rain, time, or the wounded pride of an engineer raised in the cult of perfection. He straightened, closed the hood, and looked at the mechanics gathered around. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will put it on the test track, measure compression, take cylinder head off if we must. I want to know what 80,000 kilometers look like inside this block." He paused, then added quietly, more to himself than to them, "And we will see how wrong we were." In the early 1940s, when the Willys Jeep was born on drawing boards in Toledo and Dearborn, few German officers would have imagined they would one day study it as a model. To them, the American automotive industry was a curiosity, a land of mass-produced, low-cost vehicles, crude in finish, lacking in the refinement of German marques. The Wehrmacht's light transport had grown out of the Volkswagen project and pre-war cars adapted to military use, the Kübelwagen type, 82, the Schwimmwagen, a host of staff cars and trucks built by Opel, Hawk, and Mercedes-Benz. The Jeep was something else entirely. When the U.S. Army issued its specifications for a truck, quarter-ton, 4x4, command reconnaissance in 1940, the list read like a mechanical provocation. Full four-wheel drive, 800 pounds of payload, a wheelbase under 2.13 meters, a minimum of 40 horsepower from a compact engine, the ability to climb 45-degree slopes, ford water up to the hubs, and endure continuous off-road use. And above all, the first prototype was to be delivered in 49 days. German firms, acutely aware of their own development cycles, would have considered such a demand absurd. The American Bantam Company did not. Its chief engineer quite literally sketched full-size chassis outlines with chalk on factory floors to save time. The resulting Bantam BRC met the Army's basic requirements and, more importantly, established a pattern. Small, light, simple, with a low-slung frame, lev axles on leaf springs, and a compact engine that prioritized torque at low speed. The Army, wary of relying on a small company, distributed Bantam's drawings to Willys Overland and Ford. Over the next year, through a furious series of trials at places like Camp Hollibird and Fort Benning, the design was refined. Willys brought its Go Devil engine, a 2.2-litre flathead 4 with around 60 horsepower and robust low-end torque. Ford contributed production refinements. Bantam improved suspension details. The final standardized Jeep combined the best of all three. From the perspective of an engineer like Heinemann, raised in the German tradition of individually fitted parts and workshop craftsmanship, the more decisive feature lay not under the hood, but in the way the vehicle was designed to be built. Every bolt, bracket, and shaft was dimensioned with one goal in mind: interchangeability. A wheel assembled in a Ford plant in Michigan could be mounted without hand-fitting on an axle coming out of Willys in Ohio. A transfer case gear cut in 1942 would mate perfectly with a shaft produced in 1944. The tolerances were not lax. They were carefully calculated to balance cost, durability, and ease of production, but they were generous compared to the near-microscopic precision German workshops insisted upon. The result was a machine that, on paper, seemed modest, a simple ladder frame. Two solid axles, leaf springs, drum brakes, a 3-speed gearbox with a separate transfer case, providing high and low ranges, a 4-cylinder engine producing torque, not glamour. What the paper could not fully convey was how this simplicity translated into lifespan when matched with an industrial system that could keep it supplied with parts and mechanics trained to service it. American test grounds had already shown by 1941 that a well-maintained Jeep could survive hundreds of kilometers of the worst terrain military planners could find. At Fort Benning, one prototype had covered 800 kilometers through forests, swamps, and rocky hills without a single breakdown. After inspection, the engine, suspension, and transmission were still within tolerance. In North Africa, during Operation Torch and the following Tunisian campaign, jeeps had traversed distances that made German logistics officers blanch. A reconnaissance platoon covering 60 kilometers of dried riverbed at 60 kilometers per hour. Convoys of 40 jeeps carrying nearly 11 tons of supplies over sand and broken tracks 3 times a day, with no recorded breakdowns beyond punctured tires and bent springs that could be hammered straight beside the road. In Sicily, American mobile groups, under officers like Lucian Truscott and William Darby, pushed their jeeps over mountain mule tracks, climbing and descending 30-degree gradients, covering nearly 300 kilometers in under 48 hours. The German Kübelwagen, lighter on paper, struggled on such roads. Its 2-wheel drive and limited suspension travel left it wallowing in ruts or spinning wheels helplessly on loose rock. From the German intelligence point of view, the immediate shock lay in mobility. The sheer speed with which American columns could appear in places maps declared inaccessible to vehicles. Reports from Sicily and later Brittany used phrases rarely seen in Wehrmacht memos. Unbelievable, apparently impossible, despite road conditions judged impassable. What the frontline officers did not yet fully grasp, but engineers like Heinemann would come to understand in the years after the war, was that this ability to sustain such movements rested on the same underlying philosophy that had made the Sherman's radial engine so tenacious. The Jeep's Go Devil engine was not overstressed. At roughly 60 horsepower from 2.2 liters, its specific output was modest compared to German passenger car engines of similar displacement, let alone high-performance Maybachs. But the low compression ratio, the broad torque curve, and the use of robust cast iron for block and head gave it a margin against abuse. It could run on low-octane fuel without detonating itself to pieces. It would start in cold conditions without complex rituals. It tolerated delayed oil changes better than a tight-tolerance, high-revving engine would. Coolant leaks, clogged radiators, and clogged filters could still kill it. But those were preventable with sensible maintenance, and the American system was built to make such maintenance trivial. And perhaps most importantly, the Jeep's duties rarely demanded continuous operation at maximum power. It spent most of its life cruising at moderate speeds, hauling light loads, stopping often. That kind of usage, when supported by regular lubrication and adjustment, according to the Army's technical manuals, made 50 or 60,000 miles an achievable lifetime. The odometer on the Grafenwöhr Jeep Heinemann was now examining, told just such a story. The next morning, under a low, overcast sky that smelled of wet leaves and diesel exhaust from nearby trucks, Heinemann and his team rolled the Jeep onto a patch of dry concrete beside an old tank shed. They chalked lines on the ground, set up their portable compression tester, and laid out tools on a canvas sheet. Heinemann wanted numbers. Subjective impressions were not enough. If he was to write a report for the Bundeswehr's Technical Bureau, and, indirectly, for the new alliance taking shape in the West, he needed something more than a German engineer's wounded pride and a line in a service book. They began with the basics, a warm-up run around the perimeter road to bring the engine to operating temperature. One of the younger mechanics took the wheel, more out of eagerness than necessity. The Jeep pulled away briskly, its exhaust note fading as it rounded the far corner by the old range control hut, then returning. Tires hissing on wet pavement. Back on the pad, Heinemann killed the ignition and removed the spark plugs one by one while another man held the throttle and choke open. They threaded the gauge into the first cylinder, cranked the starter, watched the needle jump in 4 distinct pulses, then climb no further. Number 1, 115 psi, the mechanic read. Heinemann checked his captured copy of the American TM 980 manual, translated and annotated in German margins. The Jeep's engine, when new, was specified for compression readings around 100 to 120 pounds per square inch, with slight variations between cylinders acceptable. They repeated the process. Number 2, 112. Number 3, 116. Number 4, 114. The figures were more even than Heinemann had expected. He had seen Maybach blocks with half the mileage show greater spread after one Russian winter. "Leak down will tell us more," he said. They pressurized each cylinder at top dead center, listening for hissing past valves, rings, or head gasket. There was some leak past the rings, inevitable after so many years. But no dramatic loss. Valves sealed well. The head gasket, often a weak point in engines that had suffered overheating, seemed sound. When they finally broke the head bolts loose and lifted the cast iron head, no overhead camshafts to complicate matters, just push rods and rocker arms. The top of the block looked surprisingly clean. A faint ridge at the top of each cylinder told the tale of thousands of piston strokes. The crosshatch pattern from original honing was partly worn away, but visible in places. There were light, vertical marks on some bores where grit had once slipped past the rings, but nothing like the deep gouging Heinemann associated with North African dust in Maybachs. He ran his fingertips lightly along one wall, feeling for unevenness. "This would have passed initial inspection," he murmured. One of the mechanics peered over his shoulder. "For 80,000 kilometers, that is all?" Heinemann nodded slowly. "That is all." They measured bore diameters at several heights and angles, comparing them to the original specifications. Wear was present, several hundredths of a millimeter of ovality in the worst cylinder, but still within what the American manual described as acceptable for continued service, especially for a vehicle that no longer needed to carry combat loads at the front. The pistons themselves bore the scars of long life, carbon deposits scraped and brushed away by generations of soldiers following instructions in English and French, ringlands worn but not hammered out. The connecting rod bearings showed copper where white metal had thinned but had been replaced at least once, judging by the mismatch of date codes. What struck Heinemann was not the absence of wear, but its character. It spoke of a machine that had worked hard much of its life, but had almost always been operated within its design envelope and cared for with predictable regularity. He stood back, wiping his hands on a rag. In 1943, he had seen Panthers arrive at frontline workshops with bores so deeply scored that compression readings varied wildly between cylinders. Oil analysis, when they had time for it, had shown metal content that would have horrified any peacetime engineer. Many of those engines had never seen an oil change on schedule. Their air filters had been inadequate for the fine dust of the Eastern Front and North Africa. Coolant systems, designed to the limit of efficiency, had little margin when fans, belts, or pumps failed. In contrast, this Jeep's ailments were almost pedestrian. The oil had been changed often enough. The air cleaner, with its oil bath, had trapped the worst the roads could throw at it. The cooling system, uncomplicated and robust, had apparently never boiled itself dry, often enough to cause serious damage. It was not indestructible. If soldiers had filled its radiator with straight water in winter and left it on a frozen ridge for a week, its block would have cracked like any other. But the American logistical machine had distributed antifreeze, timetables, and enough mechanics that such negligence had been the exception, not the rule. Heinemann asked the mechanic to fetch the German army's old maintenance records for the Kübelwagen type 82, parked nearby. They laid them side by side on the hood. The Jeep's multinational service book with its miles and French and Dutch annotations, and the German vehicle's brittle, yellowed sheets with neat Gothic script. The Kübelwagen's engine history told a different tale. First overhaul at 6,000 kilometers, second at around 12. Notes about piston replacement, regrinding of valve seats, attention to carburetor and ignition system. A line added in 1944, in a more hurried hand, spoke of a cracked case and replacement had covered 800 kilometers through forests, swamps, and rocky hills without a single breakdown. After inspection, the engine, suspension, and transmission were still within tolerance. In North Africa, during Operation Torch and the following Tunisian campaign, jeeps had traversed distances that made German logistics officers blanch. A reconnaissance platoon covering 60 kilometers of dried riverbed at 60 kilometers per hour. Convoys of 40 jeeps carrying nearly 11 tons of supplies over sand and broken tracks 3 times a day, with no recorded breakdowns beyond punctured tires and bent springs that could be hammered straight beside the road. In Sicily, American mobile groups, under officers like Lucian Truscott and William Darby, pushed their jeeps over mountain mule tracks, climbing and descending 30-degree gradients, covering nearly 300 kilometers in under 48 hours. The German Kübelwagen, lighter on paper, struggled on such roads. Its 2-wheel drive and limited suspension travel left it wallowing in ruts or spinning wheels helplessly on loose rock. From the German intelligence point of view, the immediate shock lay in mobility. The sheer speed with which American columns could appear in places maps declared inaccessible to vehicles. Reports from Sicily and later Brittany used phrases rarely seen in Wehrmacht memos. Unbelievable, apparently impossible, despite road conditions judged impassable. What the frontline officers did not yet fully grasp, but engineers like Heinemann would come to understand in the years after the war, was that this ability to sustain such movements rested on the same underlying philosophy that had made the Sherman's radial engine so tenacious. The Jeep's Go Devil engine was not overstressed. At roughly 60 horsepower from 2.2 liters, its specific output was modest compared to German passenger car engines of similar displacement, let alone high-performance Maybachs. But the low compression ratio, the broad torque curve, and the use of robust cast iron for block and head gave it a margin against abuse. It could run on low-octane fuel without detonating itself to pieces. It would start in cold conditions without complex rituals. It tolerated delayed oil changes better than a tight tolerance, high-revving engine would. Coolant leaks, clogged radiators, and clogged filters could still kill it. But those were preventable with sensible maintenance, and the American system was built to make such maintenance trivial. And perhaps most importantly, the Jeep's duties rarely demanded continuous operation at maximum power. It spent most of its life cruising at moderate speeds, hauling light loads, stopping often. That kind of usage, when supported by regular lubrication and adjustment, according to the Army's technical manuals, made 50 or 60,000 miles an achievable lifetime. The odometer on the Grafenwöhr Jeep Heinemann was now examining, told just such a story. The next morning, under a low, overcast sky that smelled of wet leaves and diesel exhaust from nearby trucks from a depot stock where the batch number had not matched, requiring minor machining, by the time the war ended, it had logged just over 20,000 kilometers in total. Respectable for the conditions and era, but barely a quarter of what the Jeep beside it had achieved on its original major components. Heinemann closed his eyes for a moment, seeing in his mind not just 2 vehicles on a damp West German range, but the larger pattern behind them. In 1941, as America's automobile industry began to spin up for war, German planners still believed they could win with fewer, higher-quality machines operated by elite crews and supported by skilled technicians. They placed their faith in design and craftsmanship, convinced that a technically superior engine or suspension would give them decisive advantage. What they had not properly accounted for was time and distance, the Eastern Front, North Africa, the long retreat from Normandy. These were measured not in kilometers that a single engine or set of tracks could endure, but in tens of thousands. Any system that could not reliably cover those distances with minimal intervention would fail, no matter how excellent it was in its first few hundred. The Jeep had never been designed as a marvel. It was, in the words of American General George Marshall, the most useful tool created for this war. It prioritized what Marshall and other planners understood to be essential: the ability to start in the morning, day after day, in mud or snow, with a driver who might have learned to drive only months earlier. From that perspective, the odometer reading on the Grafenwöhr Jeep was not a freak miracle. It was a predictable outcome of a design philosophy and an industrial system built around durability, maintainability, and mass for German engineers like Heinemann, trained before the war in the traditions of Karl Benz and Rudolf Diesel. This realization came late, and at a cost. He looked at the open engine bay one more time, then at the chalked number on his notepad, 80,000 kilometers. He thought of the Maybach HL 230 engines he had signed off on with pride in 1942, and how many of them had died before 1/10 that distance. He glanced at his team. "Write this up carefully," he said, "not as propaganda, not as admiration, as a lesson. We're not just buying vehicles from the Americans now, we are buying their way of thinking about them." The Jeep's engine ticked as it cooled, metal shrinking back into itself after the short run. In the silence that followed, the faint sound almost resembled a clock. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story,